Hello, I'm making this video in the hope that I can help out anybody who's had a similar problem to the problem I've had in the last few days, and can possibly avoid some of the heartache it caused me. This is a 1999 Nissan Terrano 2 turbo diesel. I think the engine number is 27 Ti, and it's a very common engine within lots of the Nissans and other cars, that sort of thing. My problem is that the car failed its MOT a week or so ago as a result of high readings on emissions and lots of smoke. Now, I'm no mechanic, and when I hear those sort of things it strikes fear into me, so I started to try and learn a little bit more about the engine. The engine itself is pretty standard, but it's 2.7 but with a turbo attachment, and the turbo spins up the exhaust gases, spins them through and sends the cleaned air through back into the inlet manifold, with the big square thing on the top being a thing called an intercooler. Now, I was told by various people that there could be problems with my catalyzer, there could be problems with the turbo itself, and it would be likely a complicated fix. Now, on these modern diesels, there are no controls. It's not like the old days that I remember, where you had mixture screws and adjustments that you could make, that you could weaken the mixture. But nevertheless, the engine does use a mixture of diesel fuel and air, and has to balance it so as to get the best performance against the criteria of, keeping your emissions down. So it's like a ratio. I'll start that again. So it's like a ratio between the air and the fuel, and trying to get the best oomph out of the engine, but with not too much smoke. Anyway, my first target was the turbo, which you can see here, just a little bottom bit, and you'll see that just here there's a little unit which is actually a vacuum unit. It looks at the suction in the engine and pushes and pulls on that rod, which passes to a gate which is in the exhaust manifold. I couldn't ever see that move even when I was revving the engine hard, and I figured that maybe it was a fault with that, and in fact there did turn out to be a fault with that. The little tube that sits behind here, little rubber tube, was frayed, and so there wasn't enough suction getting to that unit, and therefore it was tending not to move. But that wasn't the problem. I did take it apart, the gate moved freely, and the car faltered quite badly and was smoky when the gate was opened, which is obviously not a natural condition for it. I looked around a few other things and eventually found that I couldn't on my own get any further, so I went to a local mechanic who had a computer system, and he plugged it onto the diagnostic port, which is a 14-pin one on this car. I've got one of those OBD2 units for a more modern vehicle that I own, but I couldn't, even with the adapter, get it to work on this. And he checked through the engine on the computer. He could find absolutely nothing wrong. There were certainly no engine light and nothing wrong, but he confirmed that the emissions were high. Then he went to this unit at the front, which is the MAF or MAF sensor. I'll come in right close on it. It's upside down, but no matter. And since that is the thing that actually finds out for the engine how much air is flowing, he said, well, one way, this was half joking, you could get it through the MOT would be to disconnect the lead from that, and then of course the sense wouldn't work. And he said if the unit is working when I unplug it, the emissions should drop right back, which they did. You could see suddenly no smoke in the exhaust, but the engine was a little bit wavery and just not very comfy. And he warned me that it wouldn't drive. You could rev it standing on the spot, wouldn't drive at all, and it would be a slightly naughty way to try and fool the MOT. Well, I wasn't particularly interested in that, but I stuck with the concept of this and thought, well, essentially this flow meter must be the equivalent of a mixture screw on the old style of cars that I knew when I was a boy. And so it is the case. This thing's got a few connectors on it, 3 leads on this case, 4-pin plug, and there's a little unit that sits right into the airway coming from the air filter here and heading towards the engine, and it has a sensor which is mounted in that airflow. And what that sensor is doing, I discovered, is reacting to the airflow in a rather odd way. Rather than something like a propeller or that kind of thing. This is a little sensor. It looks a bit like a tiny resistor sitting in a little plastic hole inside the unit, and it gets hot deliberately, so it's heated by an electrical circuit, and the way it is cooled by the air and the way the resistance of the element changes with the flow of air is the information that's sent to the brain of the computer, and thus the computer knows what the mixture's meant to be. Well, I took the 2 screws out of my unit and lifted it gently out of the airflow, and immediately the engine faltered, which demonstrated to me that the sensor was working. Had there been no change in the engine when it wasn't working, then I would imagine there would be no change in or out of the system, and that was not the case, so I was pretty certain it was working. So then I went back to the internet and spent quite a little bit of time looking at people who'd been cleaning their MAF sensors, MAF sensors. And there was a lot of spiel about having to use the correct cleaner and don't touch it, they're delicate and all this sort of stuff. Eventually, looking closely at it, I thought, well, it can't be so delicate that the slightest touch is going to break it, because it's got air rushing past it. So it was more really a matter of trying to find a cleaner which wasn't so harsh as to damage the plastics around it, but would clean it effectively. And I settled on switch cleaner, electrical switch cleaner, which is the sort of stuff sold in the UK by Maplin, because it's soft on on the components of electrical bits and pieces, but has a cleaning action, and it doesn't leave much of a residue, so it wouldn't affect things. So I sprayed that onto a couple of baby buds, very gently worked around the 2 little sensors in here, and lo and behold, they went from black to brown. So from a coked up black colour, just looking like soot, to a tan brown, quite a light brown, and I just cleaned around the contacts, put it back into service, and the results were instant. I've never known a car feel so much better with so little work done to it. It was a revelation. This thing is an automatic. It now changes gear smoothly. The smoke's gone. It's got bags more oomph than I remember having, and I've had this car for 8 years. So what I'm saying here is, don't rule out the possibility that it is something as simple as this airflow sensor. Most modern vehicles have them, both diesel and petrol, and as a final warning, you can get them on the internet. I could see this unit available on the internet for about £79–80, about €100. When I went to my local spares shop, I'm in Spain, they wanted €375 for it. So if you can get away with a clean, as I did, it's going to cost you 2 baby buds and maybe a can of what's essentially isopropyl alcohol. It's going to be one heck of a lot cheaper and easier. Obviously you've got to be quite delicate with it. These are components, they're not very rugged, and just work gently away at it and clean the rough off. Or you can buy, I think it's a company called CNC, but there's a company that do sell a spray specifically for it. How much money that costs, I wouldn't know. So I wouldn't want to recommend that you do this unless you know what you're doing, and I certainly wouldn't want to take responsibility if you do it and damage. But in my case, it helped me absolutely tremendously to solve what could have been a very expensive problem. So summing up, nothing wrong with my turbo, nothing wrong with that air sensor, the suction sensor at the back, which I subsequently learned is there to dump excess when the system's sucking really hard. It dumps any excess straight through the exhaust rather than the catalyzer. Some such like that anyway. Nothing wrong with my engine management unit. In fact, it was just a dirty MAF sensor. Took me 2 minutes to clean. So this may not work for you, but I hope it does, and good luck.